On today's episode of Locked On Wild, raise your hand if you would be in a hospital bed with broken ribs. Brock Faber played. We'll talk about the end of the season presser for Guerin and John Hynes today.
You're Locked On Wild, your daily podcast on the Minnesota Wild, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
What's happening, everybody? Welcome into another episode of Locked On Wild, your daily Minnesota Wild podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Thank you, as always, for making Locked On Wild your first listen each and every day. Make sure you subscribe on YouTube and your favorite podcast platforms so you don't miss out on any new episodes throughout the week. Today's episode of Locked On Wild is brought to you by Monopoly Go. I'll admit it, I do have a competitive side, and it is a big fan of Monopoly Go, the mobile hit twist on classic Monopoly. So join your friends and download Monopoly Go, now free on the App Store or Google Play. On today's episode of Locked On Wild, we break down the end of the season presser that went much like you'd expect it did. Nothing majorly earth-shattering, although Brock Faber is a lot tougher than we thought. We'll talk about that and some interesting comments on Ryan Hartman as well, all on today's episode of Locked On Wild. My name is Seth Topol, your daily Minnesota Wild insider. Took precisely 12 hours to rest up, and we are right back to it here today. Recording later, because obviously had the end of the season presser, and I wanted a chance to watch it through first before reacting to some of the things that we heard for you. We also have another episode dropping for you in the morning. Johnny Lazarus, good friend of the show, joining us to talk about the first round of the Stanley Cup playoffs. And so we got a full look at every single series that will drop for you in the morning as well. We didn't have the explosive fireworks that last year's end of season presser had. I think there honestly was, just a realization at this point that there's no way you can slice it. This was a season that was disappointing for the Minnesota Wild. And honestly, we talked about this in the postcast. Injuries were mentioned, but injuries were not used as an excuse for what we saw this past season, which was a surprise for me. The biggest thing that was discussed as to the reason that this season did not go well was inconsistency. And that is the perfect word to use for what we saw this season. Inconsistency in the net, inconsistency with the secondary scoring, inconsistency with the special teams. So that was, I think, a pretty solid assessment of what we saw this season. Now, obviously, it's easy to react to a season like this after the fact. The biggest question is what happens for this team going forward. That obviously is the essential mission statement of Locked On Wild for the offseason, going into next year. And as was brought up to Kirill Kaprizov's face himself, Kirill was asked, if the team doesn't make the playoffs next year, are you going to change your tune and look to maybe not stay here long term? That was an actual question that was asked to Kirill Kaprizov in his media availability today. That's the big question, ladies and gentlemen. That is the big question going forward, is what does this team do? And I'm going to put some hope out there because I think there were some interesting sound bites from Guerin in this presser. Number one, which was asked directly again, I think it was Sarah McClellan that asked of the Star Tribune, what's going to happen in the offseason to prevent this from just playing out next season again? And Guerin said he is not just going to sit by and mark time. And the team is not going to just wait this out. Now, that could be scary on one side because, as I've alluded to, most of the final few weeks of the season, that could mean that there is a course correction trade coming. But at the end of the day, the thing I think that stood out to me most was addressing one of the big issues that cropped up a lot this season. And the team talked about it. John Hynes and Bill Guerin talked about it at length. Being fragile. Being a fragile team, not only from a physical standpoint, but from a mental standpoint too. And with what this team is dealing with, you're at a disadvantage against pretty much every team that you go up against throughout the season. And so in order to be able to beat those teams and compete with those teams, you have to give it everything that you have. And the acknowledgement that there were players that didn't, and that the team, by and large, wilted under adversity was an interesting one. That you saw that from the players. Honestly, one of the players who is both media availability and just being talked about by Guerin and Hynes that stood out the most today was Ryan Hartman. And Hartman said it point blank in his availability today is the Wild were not a hard team to play against. They were not a team that others had challenges going up against because they were weak. They were fragile. They did not handle adversity well. They did not handle even small levels of adversity well as a team throughout the course of the season. And is John Hynes going to be the right guy to be able to pull more of that out? We will get a full look at that coming up this upcoming season. But I was not expecting to hear that mentioned in these comments today. At the end of the day, you don't get a ton out of these. You get we need to be better. We need to you get what you pretty much are expecting coming out of this. But the fact that we were willing to admit and point out that by and large it was kind of a soft team throughout the season is at least a step that I sitting at my desk watching this actually was okay. I like that was acknowledged, and that is something that is definitely going to need to be addressed going forward. Too often the team got just pushed around and just not only that, but lost momentum, lost contain, blew the lead time and time again. And so add that to the list, the long list of things that are going to need to be addressed going forward. But that's definitely one near the top of the list, is that this team just needs some backbone. What you can do with that, free agency, trades were mentioned internally as well. All options on the table, but grow a spine is, I think, a good spot to start for this Minnesota Wild team. Now, it was interesting, some of the other comments in regards to the young players. There was certainly love given to those guys, but we'll talk about why the notion of earn your spots is great, but it only really matters if it's put into action. As we continue today's episode of Locked on Wilds after this. Today's episode of Locked on Wild is brought to you by Monopoly Go. We've all been there, either as a player or a fan. It's halftime and the scoreboard is just not looking good. You're feeling low, not sure if your team can pull out a win. But that's when you dig deep, lift your head up, and say to yourself, time to get back in the game, pull off some bank heists, and take as much of my friends' money as I possibly can. That's right, the smash hit mobile game Monopoly Go lets you compete with your friends to get the most riches and the biggest empire. It's the Monopoly you love, but on your phone anytime with tons of new twists, including leaderboards to compare your progress to your buddies. There's so much to do. You can play on countless dynamic Monopoly boards, make your friends bankrupt by smashing their landmarks with a wrecking ball, charge other players rent for your iconic properties too. You can even work with your friends to crack open community chests and in tournaments to get extra rewards and climb the leaderboard. So get back out there and put on your game face. Download Monopoly Go now free on the App Store or Google Play. Welcome back to today's episode of Locked On Wild. Once again, we thank you for making Locked On Wild your first listen each and every day. Make sure to join us tomorrow. We got a full preview for you coming up for the Stanley Cup playoffs, which start tomorrow. I don't know about all of you, but I am going to be parked in front of my TV all day. Stanley Cup playoffs, 2 games tomorrow, 4 games on Sunday. Glorious Stanley Cup playoff hockey is finally here. And if you'd like to know more about the teams that are playing, especially in my case, especially in the Eastern Conference, make sure to check out our wonderful Locked On hosts representing each of the teams in the East, whether it be the Bruins, the Panthers, the Lightning, the Maple Leafs, the Hurricanes, the Islanders, the Capitals, or the Rangers, or any of our friends in the Western Conference too. Make sure to show your support for the other Locked On hosts as well. So, scaring the veterans and putting them on notice that the young players are ready to take their spots, to play their way into particular spots in the lineup. It's a great concept. I love the notion. It's something that I think all Wild fans can agree upon, is that as the young players improve their performance, they should be given opportunities to really help this team, because that is, I think, whether you are just absolute vibes are dead mode with this Minnesota Wild franchise right now, or whether you are still a believer in what Bill Guerin is doing for this team, I think we can all agree that the prospects are going to be key for this team to getting to where they eventually want to get to. Here's the rub. I hope that notion by Bill Guerin and John Hynes, I hope that was not something that they came into the season with the understanding of. I hope that's a reaction to what we saw play out this year, because we saw the likes of Murat Kuznetsov, Liam Ugrin, Marco Rossi, Brock Faber, Declan Chisholm even. We saw those guys get opportunities on this roster as the season played out. But we went through a full season with Marcus Johansson taking a critical spot on this roster. Critical spot, and offering you really not a ton. Or seeing the likes of John Merrill, Alex Goligoski playing over a guy in Dakota Mermis who, frankly, was just better. And so it's a great concept, but John Hynes said in response to Guerin saying, if a young player plays well and it scares a rookie into, or it scares a veteran into, hey, I got to improve my performance, or I'm going to lose my spot on this line or on this roster. Like, I liked that. I applauded that. But then we got immediately after that, you don't want to rush. You don't want to rush guys into spots. You don't want to put them in too early, or you risk stunting their development. You risk shattering their confidence. You risk any number of other things. I mean, sure. But I think we saw that. I mean, we saw at the end of the season, we saw Liam Ugrin look capable. I think you could have put anybody else in that spot and gotten better results. And so this is a tipping point because it was also mentioned, Bill Guerin was asked about the guys with trade protection and if he would consider approaching them to waive for the potential to be moved. And he pretty much completely shut that down. Not going to anybody at this point. He said if he felt the need that if he felt like he had to, emphasis on had to, if he felt like he had to, he would, but he has not had any of those conversations as of right now. So, okay. I don't want to, all I'm saying is if we get to a point in which there are players playing well enough to warrant being above some of these guys in the lineup, they better be above them. Otherwise we're just getting lip service. Now, some of the other things that were interesting about what we saw from this presser today, I think the big, startling, glaring piece of information that was brought up today was that Brock Faber played the final 2 months of the season with fractured ribs. I repeat, Brock Faber played the entire final 2 months of the season with fractured ribs, played 25 minutes a night with fractured ribs, played top D minutes with fractured ribs, played on the power play and on the penalty kill with fractured ribs. I will never second guess anything that Brock Faber does in any sense ever again. And not that we did, but I know there were many that pointed out the dip in performance in the final 2 months of the season for Brock Faber might have had something to do with the fractured ribs. Now, Bill Guerin did note, and Jared Spurgeon talked today, that he is feeling great after his surgeries. Marcus Foligno is going to have surgery on his core. Doesn't feel like it's going to impact him going forward. Beyond that, Bill Guerin said medicals will be going on tomorrow, but he did not anticipate there being any other surgeries at this time. That's a sigh of relief that we got through the end of this season and Kirill, Matt Boldy, Joel Eriksson-Ek, the prospects, Marco Rossi, you name it. Those guys will all be able to go through their full off season to get themselves ready for next year. That's the encouraging sigh of relief played out in real time. But my God, I mean, I wouldn't be able, I'll just throw it out there. I wouldn't be able to podcast with fractured ribs. I would be in a hospital bed. I would be on my back until said fractured ribs healed. Brock Faber's an animal. And the fact that he even did not even entertain using it as an excuse. He just showed up to the rink every single day and went through his process, did his work. That's captain material. I want to finish today by talking about, there was a question in particular directed at Ryan Hartman that caught my attention, caught my intrigue, and Hartman's presser today did the same. So we'll talk about that to finish today's episode of Locked On Wilds after this. Today's episode of Locked On Wild is brought to you by Policy Genius. Folks, the world of life insurance and picking the policy that's right for you is a daunting task for even those that know what they're doing. Policy Genius is here to help make the process a little less intimidating. Policy Genius is the company's leading online insurance marketplace. It saves you time and money so you can provide your family with a financial safety net starting today. With Policy Genius, you can find life insurance policies that start at just $292 per $1 million of coverage per year. Some options offer same-day approval and avoid unnecessary medical exams. Policy Genius helps you compare your options from top companies, and their team of licensed experts is on hand to help talk you through it. Your work life insurance policy may not offer enough protection for your family's needs. Even worse, it may not come with you if you leave your job. Check life insurance off your to-do list in no time with Policy Genius. Head to policygenius.com/LockedOnNHL or click the link in the description to get your free life insurance quotes and see how much you could save. That's policygenius.com/LockedOnNHL. policygenius.com/LockedOnNHL. Final segment of today's episode of Locked On Wild. Once again, we thank you for making Locked On Wild your first listen each and every day. We've got a Stanley Cup Round 1 playoff preview coming up for you tomorrow morning. So make sure to join us for that. Johnny Lazarus stopping by, A-plus friend of the show, stopping by to help us take a look at all of the opening round series. And we'll talk about the playoffs throughout as well, in addition to, of course, keeping you fully up to date on everything going on with the Minnesota Wild all offseason long. There's a lot of emphasis on Ryan Hartman today, which I found interesting. First off, and look, I know at this point, it's words. The actions are really the thing that matter. But I thought it interesting that Ryan Hartman really went out of his way to talk about just how easy it was to play against the Wild this season. The Wild pride themselves in being a team, as Hartman said, that is annoying, that is hard to play against, and that people don't enjoy playing against. And there was absolutely none of that this season. So not only that, but there was a question asked to both John Hynes and Bill Guerin about Hartman specifically in the presser. And from what Hynes said, he thinks that he can get a little more out of Hartman because there were certainly plenty of games where it seemed like frustration got the best of him. He feels like he can get a little bit more out of John Hynes this season or next season. And look, let's just acknowledge the fact that if you cut out a percentage of Ryan Hartman's penalties out of the equation, Hartman was tied for 5th on the team in goals, a 20-goal season this year. And I think if we put him in a spot that is more suited for where he should be at in the lineup, third line in particular. I think if you pencil him in as a third line guy and not even I think he has shown that he is a little more capable of being a good winger for this team as opposed to a center. I am penciling right now, depending on what happens with Danila Yurov, which last I checked still has not signed. Depending on what happens with Danila Yurov, if you go into the season with Foligno, Kuznetsov, and Hartman as your third line, that's gonna be a line that people are not gonna enjoy playing against. And I think Kuznetsov having Hartman, who is a shooter, with him, because he's not going to vault. He's not going to vault Rossi. He's not going to vault Eriksson Ek. And so if he is a third line center, at least to start next season, that's not necessarily a knock on him as a player. That's just indicative of what is in front of him in the lineup. And you're not gonna supplant those guys. The thing I think that is key here is that you're not having to rely on these other guys to be your centers out of necessity, because you have guys that can fill those spots and are natural centers. I think the team views Hartman as a guy who can be somebody that gives them edge, but can also give them scoring too. He just walks a fine line, and this, I'm sure, was brought up in his exit interview. But if John Hynes and the coaching staff can get him to eliminate those checkout games where the frustration gets the best of him and he ends up taking a game misconduct or a match penalty or ends up going to the box 3 or 4 times, if you can use that frustrated energy and harness that and bottle that up and channel that into offensive production, and you get, if you can have Hartman be somebody that can still give you 20 goals as a third line guy next year, and going forward, that's then where this team starts to climb back up. You're going to, best case scenario, you're going to get Danil Yurov, you're going to get Liam Ugrin, you're going to get Murat Huznadinov on this team from the jump next season, and are going to work them into the equation seamlessly. Which means then that if you have Hartman deployed on your third line, that's going to give you the opportunity to create some mismatches in the lineup. So I found it interesting that there was kind of an emphasis on that, which leads to believe that Hartman is a key figure in the depth scoring for this team. He's not going to be a focal point on your team. He's not going to be a who's to say he can't be, though, a Matt Duchene type. Matt Duchene that the Dallas Stars signed, he is playing a second line role for them, but he scored 28 goals. Just a shooter that can give you offense and can give you some defense and some bite too. I don't know. It struck me as interesting that the coaching staff and Bill Guerin talked about him specifically and what they think he can bring to the table, and if he can avoid that frustration energy turning into bad energy and can turn it into good stuff, then that's where he can be a huge difference maker for this team. And the final thing I wanted to talk about is it was just a throwaway line, but it seems like John Hynes came away really impressed with Liam Ugrin this season in the 3 games that he played down the stretch. It seemed like and I don't know if it was just Guerin trying to set him up for the question, but it seemed like Guerin made note of it. Hynes talked about it. And so if there's anybody that's going to kind of supplant and take over for Marcus Johansson on that second line, it's probably going to be Liam Ugrin. And that is my takeaway for this presser, and one of the big pieces that needs to be kept in mind moving through the offseason into next year is Bill Guerin talked about scaring the veterans. If the young players play well enough to take jobs, they're going to be taken. So we need to not be afraid of hurting feelings, not be afraid of hurting feelings of players if youngsters play better than them and take their spots. Like, the alternative is not playing on the team. And so if the young players, like, this is how a roster that is on the older side, that is old and is on the slow side, this is how you get out of that, is by adding young players with some jump, with some life, with some energy, adding them to the mix and allowing them to fill the spots that the veterans can't, because the veterans can't do it anymore. That's how you move out of this spot and how you go forward. So take those words to heart and act on them. Time will tell if we see that happen. So yeah, didn't get a ton, but there were still some things to pull away from that end of season presser. So that's all we got for you here for today. Thank you for joining us for today's episode of Locked On Wild. Make sure to hit the like button as you head out for the day, and make sure to subscribe on your favorite podcast platforms, YouTube, as well as Apple Podcasts, Spotify, wherever you listen. We thank you for tuning in, and we thank you for making Locked On Wild your first choice for Minnesota Wild news and information here all week long. We've got new episodes for you every Monday through Friday as part of the Locked On Podcast Network.